The north is cold and full of whispers.
The crypts of Winterfell went deeper than anyone had told Bran they did. He knew the upper levels. Every Stark child did, the long row of stone kings on their chairs, each one with a sword across his knees and a direwolf at his feet. Their names carved in letters Maester Luwin had made Bran memorize before he was 5. He knew the smell of those levels, cold granite, dead candle smoke, and the deep indifferent nothing of stone that hadn't changed in 300 years. The lower levels smelled different. Something underneath the stone smell, something metallic and dry, like the inside of a sealed copper vessel, like something had been held here, contained locked against all the intentions of time before Bran Stark, or his father's father, had ever drawn breath. He hadn't meant to find the gap. He'd been chasing a sound, low, irregular, not a rat, not the drain channels moving with the wind, and the chase had taken him past the last carved king and into the rougher passage beyond, where the ceiling dropped and the torchlight from above barely reached. The gap in the collapsed section of the lower wall was perhaps 18 inches across and 2 feet high. A child's door. Nothing bigger would fit. Jon would find out later. He'd be furious for about 30 seconds, which was exactly the amount of time it always took him to remember that being furious at Bran for climbing into places he shouldn't was a permanent condition and a useless one. Bran went through on his stomach, torch held out ahead of him. The passage on the other side was not on any map Luwin had ever shown him. He felt the difference before he understood it, the way certain things announce themselves through the palms of your hands before your mind catches up. The stone here was older, cut differently. Not the chiseled precision of the crypts above, but flat carved. Deliberate lines impressed into the rock face by something that had worked slowly, patiently, with a care that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with permanence. Then the runes. He brought the torch closer. They covered the passage walls entirely, not scattered, not decorative. They moved in rows, column after column, each character the same size. Each line spaced with the same locked intention. He'd seen runes before, in the old documents Luwin used for lessons. These were different, not a record of kings' names, not a prayer. The characters repeated in patterns. They cycled, the same clusters appearing in different combinations. The way numbers arranged in an equation were not just marks, but a machine, something that was doing something, even when no one was reading it. He followed them to the passage's end. The wall there had no seam, just wall, flat and final. He almost turned back. He was 7 years old, and the torch was burning lower than he'd like. He almost missed the edge. Torchlight caught it, a straight line, too precise for natural stone, running vertical at his eye height, which meant an adult looking at this wall would be looking over it entirely. He pressed his thumb to the line and felt, beneath 2 centuries of compacted mineral dust, the specific cold of old metal. Bronze. He swept his thumb sideways, and the truth of it became clear, a plate, flush fitted into the wall with a craftsman's patience. Its surface covered in the same rune patterns as the passage walls, but denser here, layered, the way a sentence is denser than a single word. He found the handle because he was looking for it. Carved bronze, gone so far past green with age that it had almost circled back to gray. A dire wolf's head. The wolf's eyes were pale, the whitish mineral film that forms when bronze has waited long enough, and they looked at him with the flat, patient expression of something that had been expecting this for a very long time. He pulled. The room was dry. That was the first thing Jon noticed when Bran led him back to it. Everything in it was wrong for something that had been underground in the north for centuries. No moisture on the walls. No rot smell, no damp, no evidence of the 10,000 winters that had passed above it. The walls had been sealed with a resin compound, dark and hard, brushed into every joint and cracked with a thoroughness that had locked out time itself. No bodies. No burial offerings, no collapsed sections, no water staining, no rust on any fitting. What wasn't there was the loudest thing in the room. "Don't touch anything until I've seen it," Jon said. Bran nodded with the specific sincerity of a boy who intends to touch everything the moment Jon's back turns. The bronze record sat in a chest, stone body, Bronze-fitted lid, sealed with the same resin as the walls. 200 sheets, approximately, each one the size of a large parchment page. Each one impressed on both sides with rune notation so dense it had to be read like a map rather than a text. Jon lifted one and felt its weight. Heavier than it looked. Heavier than iron. Almost. Real permanence. Someone had made these to outlast everything that might try to destroy them, not for a decade, not for a reign, but for the kind of time that did not have a human name. Under the metal sheets, rolled hide, treated against moisture so thoroughly that it was still supple, still capable of being unrolled without cracking. Jon opened the first one carefully and held his torch close. No runes on this. No notation. Pure illustration. A machine. Something he had no name for. A frame. A long arm on a pivot. What might have been a counterweight housing at one end, and something like a sling arrangement at the other. Every component labeled in runic notation. Every joint shown in cross-section, the way a maester would diagram a bone. Not a drawing made to be admired, a document made to be followed. An instruction for building something he had never imagined and could not yet fully see. He unrolled a second roll, a different machine. Lower, wider, horizontal arms suggesting tension at a scale no individual man could manage. He unrolled a third and stopped. Bran? He didn't look up. Put it down. Bran lowered the bronze disc he'd taken from the bottom of the chest. Did not return it. Just held it loosely at his side with the calm of a boy who knows he's already won. And said, "It's warm." 8 inches across. A single rune at its center, isolated on the face, surrounded by negative space that made the character feel weighted in a way the dense rune rows on the records did not. Jon recognized it. He'd walked past the heart tree that morning, as he had walked past it every morning for 14 years. The rune carved above the weirwood's pale eyes and its open bleeding mouth. Not similar to what was on this disc. Identical. Bran held the disc and his eyes went somewhere inward, somewhere his face didn't fully follow, somewhere quiet and very far away, and he didn't say anything else. They carried everything up in 2 trips. Ned Stark received the chest and the schematic rolls in his solar with the same expression he used for news he hadn't wanted. Still, contained, something moving behind it that he did not allow onto his face. He looked at the records for a long time without speaking. He studied 2 of the schematics with the hide unrolled flat across his table, and his candle moved close. He looked at the bronze disc last, and held it and set it down with the specific care of a man who has just understood that what he is holding is not an artifact, it is a question. "Go to sleep," he said. "Both of you." Jon lay by the fire and did not sleep. He woke the first time and his father had 3 bronze records open in front of him, his eyes moving across the rune notation with the slow, deliberate attention of a man translating something he cannot afford to mistranslate. The candle burned straight. The room was quiet. He woke the second time to gray pre-dawn light in the window and a different quality of silence. Ned Stark was sitting with the last schematic roll closed in his lap. His hands were flat on top of it, not pressing, just resting there. Except they were not entirely still. A fine tremor ran through them, the kind that cold worked into a man's joints after a long ranging. The solar was not cold. Old Nan's voice moved through the room without being spoken. The hammer that broke the dead men's gates. The bronze spiders that stung from 100 yards. The tree bow that split the stone of the Night King's tower. Jon had always filed those stories in the place where interesting things that were not real lived, alongside giants and the children of the forest, and a war so old it had no witnesses. Too large to be literal. Too strange to be instruction. His father was looking at the bronze disc on the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had just discovered that a wall he has always walked past is actually a door, that every story he filed away as myth was a blueprint, that someone 8,000 years ago put these things in the ground specifically for the moment when they would be needed again. His hands would not stop their fine trembling. Jon closed his eyes before Ned could look up and find him watching. When he opened them again, the solar was empty. The records were stacked neatly at the table's edge. The schematics were rolled and retied. The bronze disc was gone. Through the window, The sound of hooves on the courtyard cobblestones, moving south, moving fast. Moving through the main gate before the sun had cleared the horizon. His father was already on the road to White Harbor. Wyman Manderley was not what the South believed him to be. The South believed him fat and harmless and grateful, a Southron lord given a northern city 300 years ago, who had spent 3 centuries thanking the Starks for it with fish and loyalty and a pleasantness that suggested no particular threat. The South had never watched Wyman Manderley red. Ned had. He watched him now. The solar of the new castle faced the harbor, and through its windows the morning light came off the water white and clean and very cold. Manderley had not moved in 11 minutes. Ned had counted. The schematic roll was spread flat across the table, both corners weighted with bronze cups, and Manderley's eyes were moving across it the way a man reads something that keeps rearranging itself as he goes, not from confusion, but from recognition. From the sensation of a thing fitting into a space that had been empty so long he'd forgotten its shape. He looked up. His face had not changed. "How many?" he said. "Enough," Ned said. Manderley looked at the schematic one more time. A single beat of silence, not the silence of a man deciding, but of a man who has already decided and is simply finishing his thought. He called for his steward before Ned had drawn another breath. That was the Wyman Manderley the South had never seen. The man who heard a thing and moved. The warehouse complex adjacent to the stone quays had been used for timber storage before the winter. 3 buildings, repurposed in 2 weeks. Ned walked the space with Manderley's master builder on the 3rd day and watched the man's lips move as he calculated load-bearing requirements from the schematic measurements Ned had copied onto fresh parchment. The builder was a shipwright. He understood stress and load and how things were meant to bear weight across long spans. He looked at the Scorpion King specifications for a long time and then said it was essentially a ship's bow arrangement, only the bow was the size of a coastal cutter and was meant to fire something sideways instead of moving through water. That was, Ned said, approximately correct. The bronze came through Manderley's Bravosi trade routes, recorded in the manifests as structural fittings for harbor reinforcement. Nobody looked closely at White Harbor's harbor manifests. Nobody had reason to. The ironwood came south from the Wolfswood in timber wagons that had made the same journey every autumn for 40 years. Under the same winter preparation orders Winterfell had always issued. The drivers were paid extra and told nothing. They didn't ask. The 3rd craftsman arrived unannounced on a Tuesday, brought south by a rider Manderley had sent to the eastern villages near Skagos without explanation. He was very old. He had worked with bronze his entire life, cups and clasps and fishing weights and, once, a full suit of plate for a lord who'd since died, and whose castle had since crumbled into the earth. He said nothing when Manderley's man showed him through the warehouse door. He walked the full length of the space with his hands clasped at his back. He stopped in front of the copper and hide assembly diagram Ned had mounted on the interior wall, the largest schematic, 6 feet across, showing the Scorpion King in full cross-section with every joint and fitting labeled. He stood in front of it for 4 minutes. Then he said that his grandfather's grandfather was said to have built something like this, once, long ago, somewhere in the Eastern Reach, and he had never believed it until now. That was all he said. He went to the workbench, picked up a bronze rod, and began checking its composition by the weight of it in his palm. The Scorpion Kings came first, smaller than the trebuchets, faster to build, the technology closest to existing Scorpion designs, though calling them similar to existing Scorpion designs was the way you might call the ocean similar to a cup of water. The ironwood frames went up in the 3rd month. The tension arms, steam bent from the densest timber the Wolfswood had delivered, each section heavy enough to require 2 men, were fitted in the 4th. The sinew cord was the old man's work almost entirely, twisted from materials he requisitioned without explanation and received without question. Because Manderley had told his store's keeper that the old man was to have whatever he asked for. The first full-tension test happened on a gray morning in the 5th month. Nobody spoke when the cord was drawn to full pull. The sound the ironwood arm made under tension was not what any of them had expected. Not the familiar thrum of a scorpion being set, that high, fibrous note, a sound with edges. This was lower Longer it came from inside the wood rather than from the cord, as though the ironwood remembered being a living thing and objected to this new purpose from somewhere deep in its grain. It rose in pitch as the tension built. It held, sustained, resonant, a sound Ned had no analogy for in his experience, which was not small. He looked at the old man. The old man was looking at the arm with his head slightly tilted, the expression of a man hearing a voice he recognizes but cannot place. The test bolt was a rough bronze-jacketed shaft, weighted forward, 42 inches long. The target was a stone pillar from a decommissioned granary, hauled into the yard on a cart and set approximately 80 yards out. The bolt arrived before the sound did. The pillar's upper third was gone, not cracked, gone in the sense that stone had been converted from a structural object into a spread of fragments in the time it took the release sound to travel 80 yards. The fragments covered a diameter of roughly 12 feet behind where the pillar had been. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, the shipwright said, very quietly, that they should probably move the target further back next time. The runic trebuchet cost Ned more sleep than anything else in the forge's first 6 months. The ironwood throwing arm had to be steam-bent into the precise curve the schematic specified, and the first 2 attempts cracked before they reached the correct angle. The craftsman applying southern timber techniques to a wood that did not behave like southern timber, misreading the rune notation for the bending sequence. The third attempt, following the bronze record more carefully, and with the old man's translation laid alongside character by character, produced an arm that curved cleanly and held without stress fractures. When they fitted it to the chassis and attached the counterweight housing for the first static test, Ned put his hand against the arm and felt the tension it was already holding just from its own bent weight. Like a thing perpetually ready, like a thing that had been waiting for this specific purpose since the tree first took root. The counterweight dropped in the 7th month. The arm moved through its arc in less than a second, and the sound it made at full extension was not the single sustained voice of the Scorpion King. It was a chord. The throwing arm, the chassis braces, the counterweight housing, all of them speaking at once in the same resonant register, a concord Ned felt in his back teeth before he heard it properly. Half a second. Then, silence. Then the test stone, 300 pounds of rough block, landed on the far side of the harbor district in empty ground they'd cleared for exactly this moment, and left a crater in the earth that Ned walked out to look at afterward and stood in front of for a long time without speaking. Manderley watched from 20 feet away. He said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Build more." The frost salt discovery happened in the 8th month. By accident. By a young engineer named Myrna, who had no formal title and had arrived in Manderley's household from somewhere vague that Manderley had declined to specify and Ned had declined to press. She found the bronze cylinder tucked between 2 machine schematics in the record chest, small, perhaps 8 inches long, sealed at both ends with the same resin compound that had preserved the vault. Inside, rolled tight around a copper spindle, a piece of treated hide smaller than any of the others. The rune notation was the same system as the machines, but the subject was entirely different. Not a machine. A compound. A recipe, 3 minerals, their proportions specified in the same runic measurement notation. Their combination process outlined in 12 steps, each step numbered. The name was 2 rune characters combined in a way she hadn't seen before. She brought it to the old man. He looked at it and said it approximated, roughly, the concept of ice and earth together. Ned read it as frost salt. The name held. Myrna identified 2 of the 3 component minerals from Manderley's stores within the hour. The third, a specific volcanic salt she found in old White Harbor trading manifests, last imported from Dragonstone's abandoned trading posts 40 years prior. She told Ned the third component wasn't locally available. Her voice was careful. She wasn't entirely certain it mattered. Ned sent for it that afternoon without explaining why. Something in the schematic's placement, tucked between the machines, not stored separately, included deliberately by hands that had thought carefully about what would be needed, made him unwilling to leave it undone. Whatever it was for, the person who sealed this vault believed it belonged alongside the machines. That was enough. The Raven arrived 8 months into construction. Ned read the message once, standing, and then held it over the candle and watched it burn down to nothing on the stone floor. 2 words in a cipher he recognized, not Littlefinger's hand but Lysa Arryn's, the cipher she and Catelyn had used as girls, and that Jon Arryn had learned after the marriage. One of the few codes that had never passed through any maester's hands. Come now. Lysa would not use that cipher lightly. She would not use it at all unless something had happened to Jon that could not be written plainly. Jon Arryn was dead. It was the only thing those 2 words could mean. He spent one night writing letters to the engineers with specific instructions, letters to Manderley with the contingency arrangements, the material orders, the names of the men he trusted to continue in his absence. One letter he sealed in wax with the Stark direwolf and locked inside a leather case, and in the morning he gave it to Robb in the courtyard of the new castle, with his hands completely still, which took everything he had. "If the ravens stop," he said. He looked at his son, 15 years old, with Catelyn's eyes and his own jaw, holding the case with both hands and not looking at it. "If you don't hear from me in 30 days. He stopped. There was no way to say this that made it smaller than it was. "Open it. Follow what it says. All of it." He did not explain further. He did not embrace him. He put his hand on Robb's shoulder for a moment, brief and firm, and then he mounted and turned the horse south. He did not look back at the forge. The Hammer of the North sat half-assembled in the eastern warehouse. Its ironwood frame reached 12 feet into the rafters. Its counterweight housing was still incomplete, the bronze fittings not yet joined. The throwing arm rested at an angle against the far wall. Waiting, early morning light came through the high eastern window and found the bronze fittings and lit them. Just the fittings. The rest of the machine too dense and too dark to catch anything. The fittings glowed in the gray light like something already alive. The old man from the eastern villages was there alone. The other craftsmen came later. He had never needed them to be there when he arrived. He was sanding a joint where 2 ironwood sections met, slow circular motion, checking by feel for high spots that the eye couldn't find, his hands knowing what they were looking for without instruction from his mind. He stopped and ran his palm flat along the ironwood frame, just resting it there, feeling something in the grain, something the tree had carried from the wolfswood, through the cutting and the bending and the months of shaping, something that had not been disturbed by any of it. He stood like that for a moment. Then he picked up the sandpaper and kept working. The ravens stopped on day 23. Not all at once, they thinned first, which was the thing that made Robb's stomach drop before he understood why. 3 in a week, then 1, then nothing. He sent his own south on day 25 and waited. On day 27 the reply he expected did not come. On day 28 he stopped sleeping properly. On day 29 he took the leather case out of the locked chest in his solar and sat with it on the table in front of him for an hour without opening it. He opened it on day 30. Exactly day 30. He was 15 years old, and he kept the case unopened for exactly 30 days. Because his father had said 30 days, and his father did not say things he did not mean. Inside, a map of White Harbor with 3 buildings marked in Ned's hand. An inventory list, names, measurements, quantities, written in the same stripped-down notation Ned used for military correspondence, no word wasted. 7 engineers' names, each with a note beside them indicating their specific knowledge. A schematic roll showing the Scorpion King in assembly sequence, slightly larger than the ones from the vault. And a letter. It began not with sentiment, not with what Robb feared it might begin with, the kind of opening that means a man knows he might not come back. It began with the forge's construction timeline, the current completion percentage of each machine type, the location of the frost salt compound, and the name of the woman who understood what it was for. Ned Stark's accounting in the precise language of a lord who expected his heir to need this information immediately and practically. The last line was 3 sentences. The first men did not lose the long night because they were lucky. Open the vault again. The disk is yours. Robb's hands were perfectly steady on the parchment, not because he was calm. His hands were steady because his body had not yet caught up with what his mind was reading, and in the gap between the information arriving and the body deciding what to do about it, everything simply continued. Heartbeat, breath, the pressure of his fingers on the paper, the sound of Winterfell's yard outside the window. He sat at his father's table in his father's solar, and his hands were steady the way a man's hands are steady before the wound begins to hurt. He sent for the lords. The Great John arrived first. He was always first. He arrived the way he arrived at everything, filling the doorway before he was properly through it, his voice moving ahead of his body, announcing his intentions to the room before the room had prepared itself. He said he would ride south tonight, personally, with every man the last hearth could raise, and he would pull the Lannister capital apart, stone from stone. And he wanted to know what Robb Stark was waiting for. Robb placed the Scorpion King schematic on the table between them. The Great John looked at it. His voice stopped. He looked at it for a long time. His finger traced the throwing arm's curve without touching the parchment, hovering a quarter-inch above it, as if he wasn't certain the thing was real enough to be touched. "Are these real?" he said. Not quite a question. A thing stated with a question attached to the end of it, the way you said it when you already knew the answer and needed a moment to let the answer settle. "They're already built," Robb said. A silence. "Then what in seven hells are we waiting for?" said the Great John Umber, and sat down. Lord Karstark came the following morning. Lords Dustin and Hornwood together. Lord Mormont alone, riding through the night from Bear Island with his raven on his shoulder and his face set in the expression it wore for things that could not be undone. They gathered in Winterfell's great hall, with varying degrees of fury and grief, and the specific tension of men who need to act and have no direction yet to act in. And Robb stood at the head of his father's table, and told them what was in the leather case, and then told them about the vault, and then took them to White Harbor. Manderly met them at the warehouse doors. He opened them himself, which was not a thing Wyman Manderly did for guests. He stepped back and let the morning light fall through the gap, and the northern lords rode forward and stopped. Lord Karstark was first through on horseback. His jaw set the moment he cleared the door, not surprise exactly, the expression of a man whose back has been hurting him for years, who has finally been told precisely what is wrong with it. He circled the nearest Scorpion King twice on horseback, his eyes moving over every joint and fitting with the attention of a man who had built things and knew what it meant for a thing to be built well. He dismounted on the second pass. He placed his hand flat against the ironwood frame, not examining it, not testing it, just placing it there, feeling what was underneath. He stood like that without speaking for long enough that his horse shifted and nosed at his shoulder, and he ignored the horse entirely. The Greatjon walked straight to the trebuchet. He stopped in front of it and tilted his head back to take in the full height of the throwing arm, the curve of it, the scale of a thing built to an architecture that dwarfed every siege engine any of them had seen in their lives. His face did one single thing. It opened. Every closed, armored, habitual surface of Great John Umber's expression simply stopped doing what it usually did. And what was underneath was something Robb had no precise name for. Something very old. Something that had been waiting to be shown, a thing it already half knew existed. Mormont didn't dismount. He walked his horse the full length of the warehouse and back, reading each machine the way he read reports, systematically, without expression, storing information. At the end of the second pass, he stopped beside Robb and said that if these worked the way the schematic suggested, the wall's garrison would need to know about it. Robb said, "The wall is where they're going." After, Mormont looked at him for a moment, nodded once, and walked his horse back outside. Catelyn arrived the following morning. She came from River Run through channels Robb hadn't fully tracked, alone except for 2 guards, which meant she'd been riding fast. She didn't come to the new castle first. She came straight to the warehouse district, which meant someone had told her, or she had simply known. She walked the full line of machines without speaking. Her hands were clasped at her back. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was working through something too large to resolve quickly, still on the surface, everything happening underneath. She stopped at the hammer. The largest, still not fully assembled, its throwing arm resting against the eastern wall, the counterweight housing not yet fitted. She stood in front of it and looked up at the ironwood frame the way you looked at something you were trying to take the full measure of and couldn't quite manage from where you stood. She turned to Robb. "Your father built these for the long night," she said. Not a question. not comfort. A fact being stated plainly so that both of them could agree on it before anything else happened. "I know," Robb said. She looked at him, at his face specifically, the way she looked at the children when she was checking for damage before registering anything else. Then she said, "We're going to use them to get him back. Not we could. Not we should try. We are going to." She said it the way she said things she had already decided were true. And Robb understood that the decision had been made somewhere on the road between River Run and White Harbor and was not available for further consideration. "Yes," he said. She walked back to the new castle. The conference that followed lasted 4 hours and covered everything. The column left White Harbor on a gray morning 12 days later. The machine carriages moved at 10 miles a day. The cavalry rode ahead. The weight of the machines was distributed across ironwood, reinforced axles Manderley's engineers had spent 6 weeks designing, and even so the wheels left ruts in the King's Road deep enough to fill with standing rainwater. The column stretched behind Robb's cavalry for nearly a mile. Cavalry first, then the Scorpion King carriages, then the trebuchets, then the supply train, then the hammer's components wrapped in oiled canvas and lashed to frames built specifically to hold each piece. The small folk came to the roadside. Nobody organized them. No rider went ahead to announce anything. They appeared in ones and twos first, standing at the field's edge, watching the machines roll past with expressions Robb couldn't fully read. Then in larger groups. Families from the farms along the King's Road, children on fence posts, old men standing in the cold without cloaks, as if they hadn't noticed the temperature. Some of them knew what they were looking at. Most of them didn't, not precisely. But they felt something in the weight of the carriages, and the low groan of the ironwood spoke wheels on the road, and the scale of what was moving past them. Several of them, without being told, without anyone demonstrating it first, went down onto one knee in the mud at the roadside. Robb did not stop. He looked straight ahead. He felt it at his back all the same. The northern edge of the neck took 2 full days. The disassembly was precise, numbered components, marked connections, every piece catalogued before it came off the carriage so it could go back on in the correct order south of the neck. The engineers moved through it methodically. The Greychon tried to assist with the trebuchet's counterweight housing on the first afternoon, and was redirected with a politeness that barely concealed the fact that his hands were wrong for this particular task. He accepted this with less fury than Robb had expected. He stepped back and watched instead, which was, for the Greychon Umber, something close to patience. Howland Reed appeared at dawn on the second day. One moment the pre-dawn gray of the neck's edge was empty of everything except reed beds and still water. Then, Howland Reed was standing 10 feet away, as though he had grown there overnight. Smaller than Robb had imagined for a man his father spoke about the way Ned rarely spoke about anyone, as an absolute, as something certain in an uncertain world. Gray eyes the color of swamp water, graying hair, a stillness that was not the stillness of a man waiting, but of a man who had long since stopped needing to wait. He looked at the components laid out across the ground, at the engineers moving between them with their lists, at the canvas-wrapped pieces of the hammer resting on their transport frames. He said, "Follow my people." Then he walked into the neck and his people appeared from the reed channels, crannogmen in flat-bottomed boats that emerged from the swamp as if the water had simply decided to produce them, and they moved to the bank and waited without speaking. The column moved through the neck in darkness. Pre-dawn, the sky a deep undifferentiated black above the reed beds. Torches burning low in the boats and reflecting off the water below. Not clean reflections, but broken ones, scattered by the push of punt poles and the slow current. The crannogmen did not speak. The ironwood beams sat in the boats wrong, too dense for their volume, riding lower than timber had any right to ride. Each boat heavier than it looked, and moving through the channels with a slowness that had nothing to do with the current. Robb watched from the causeway above. The King's Road ran raised above the swamp here, and he sat his horse on it and looked down at the water and the torches and the slow movement of things that had been whole and were now in pieces, the throwing arms, the frames, the counterweight housings, wrapped in canvas, moving south through black water in the dark. In pieces, in darkness, his father's machines looked like something drowned. like something pulled from the bottom of a very old sea, like something that had been down there in the cold and the dark for 8,000 years, and had finally, in the hands of men who moved without speaking through water that swallowed sound, begun the slow work of rising. Walder Frey had outlived 4 kings. He had done this not through courage or military genius or any of the qualities the song celebrated in great men, but through a single faculty he had exercised every day of his 90 years with more discipline than most men applied to anything. He watched which way the river ran. He watched it early. He positioned himself accordingly, and he held his position, and he outlived the men who had been too proud or too stupid or too honest to do the same. He was doing it now. The ravens from King's Landing had been arriving for months. Ned Stark arrested, his household slaughtered in the throne room, 2 of his daughters in Lannister hands. The ravens from the north came less frequently, the Stark bannermen calling their forces, the machine column moving south, reports from small folk on the King's Road that were garbled and inconsistent, and which Walder had been discounting as rural exaggeration. Strange wagons, bronze towers, things that didn't fit into any strategic category he had a name for. He had Robb Stark's summons for passage pinned to the table in front of him, weighted at its corners, and beside it his own reply, his terms, 3 paragraphs of them, covering marriage to one of his daughters or granddaughters, a gift of unspecified significant value, military alliance, and renegotiation rights at the end of hostilities. Standard terms. The terms of a man who understood that his bridge was the only crossing between the north and the riverlands for 80 miles in either direction. He understood what his bridge was worth. He had always understood what his bridge was worth. It was the only inheritance he had improved upon. He was 90 years old. He had been negotiating from this castle since before Robb Stark's father was born. He read the summons one more time and called for his garrison commander and his maester, and waited in his chair by the fire for the Stark boy to arrive at his gates and learn the price of the Green Fork. The garrison on the north tower saw the cavalry first. Standard expected the Stark banners moving south on the King's Road, the column raising dust in the cold air. Perhaps 800 horse in the vanguard, tight and disciplined, moving at a pace that suggested they were not in a hurry and not trying to appear as though they weren't. Walder was at his window when the cavalry pulled up a quarter-mile north of the Twins and stopped. He watched Robb Stark's banner reach the front of the column and stop with it. No herald came forward. No rider approached the gates. Nothing happened for several minutes. Then, something came over the hill north of the Twins that Walder Frey did not understand. He understood cavalry. He understood supply trains and siege engines, and the specific silhouette of a trebuchet being moved on campaign, because he had read enough military correspondence in his life to know what the pieces of a trebuchet looked like when they were carried on wagons. He knew that silhouette. This was not that silhouette. The carriages that crested the hill behind Robb Stark's cavalry were too large, and their shape was wrong, the frames too high, the ironwood spars crossing them at angles that no conventional siege engine required. The machines on them sat with a density, a solidity, that made the eye register their scale correctly only on the second or third look. Because on the first look the mind refused to credit that something this size could be moved overland. There were 6 of them in this first grouping, and behind them, larger still, 2 that required double the carriage width and had pieces wrapped in oiled canvas strapped alongside them. Walder stood at his window, and his garrison commander appeared at his shoulder and said that he didn't know what those were and had never seen anything like them. Walder told him to find out. The garrison commander left. He was gone for 11 minutes. He came back and said that his men on the north wall believed the front grouping were very large scorpions of a design they had no documentation of, and the 2 larger units might be trebuchets, but trebuchets built to a scale that exceeded anything in his experience of siegecraft. Walder looked at his towers. Squat. Functional. The work of his father and his grandfather and a generation before that, built from the stone of the Green Fork's bed and maintained for 80 years against the understanding that the bridge between them was the most valuable piece of ground in the Riverlands. He said, "Send word. We require time to consider Lord Stark's terms." His rider crossed the bridge, approached the northern position, came back 11 minutes later. The rider said that Lord Stark's response was that the phrase had until the machine was loaded. The trebuchet was assembled in the field north of the Twins with the unhurried precision of men who had done this before. Walder watched it from his window. The counterweight housing went up first. Then the chassis frame, ironwood sections socketing together in a sequence that was clearly engineered for speed of assembly, each piece moving into the next without difficulty, the craftsmen working without instruction because they didn't need it. The throwing arm came last, pivoting up into position as the sun moved a measurable distance across the sky. And when it reached its full height and the machine was complete and standing in the field with the throwing arm cranked back to draw position, Walder understood for the first time, precisely and without any further room for interpretation, what he was looking at. He had been thinking of it as a siege engine, something with a range and a trajectory and a delivery capability that could be assessed mathematically against the thickness of his walls and the distance between his towers and the structural integrity of his gates. Standing at its full height, the trebuchet was not a siege engine. It was a question being asked of him personally. The question was, would he like to negotiate, or would he like to answer a different question? A rider came through the north gate, carrying a single sentence on a folded piece of parchment. Walder read it and then read it again. Open the bridge or I demonstrate the machine. Not or I will destroy your castle. Not or I will lay siege to the Twins. Not any form of threat in the conventional sense, nothing that implied a range of possible outcomes and positioned Walder somewhere along that range based on his response. Just the machine on one side and the bridge on the other, and Robb Stark's signature at the bottom. Walder had been negotiating for 90 years. In 90 years, nobody had ever given him exactly two options. His hands went to the windowsill. He didn't notice he'd moved them there. He sent no reply. The counterweight dropped. The sound arrived a full 2 seconds before Walder processed what had happened. It wasn't the sound he expected. The crack and grind of stone on stone, the catastrophic noise of a direct hit on a wall or a gate. It was lower than that. A deep, percussive concussion, felt in the chest as much as heard, followed by a secondary sound that was architectural, the specific groan and fracture pattern of masonry, undergoing a stress it was not designed to survive. He looked at the northern keep's eastern corner, the subsidiary tower there, the small one, the one that had been his grandfather's guard post before the second rebuild, the one that stored seasonal equipment and held perhaps 2 men on rotation when the garrison was at full strength. The subsidiary tower's upper third was gone. Not fallen outward, not collapsed in the way walls collapsed, stone faces peeling away and tumbling down the exterior. Gone in the sense that the upper 15 feet of masonry had ceased to occupy the position it had occupied for 80 years, and now occupied a spread of rubble on the interior side of the keep, as though the tower had been struck from a direction that drove everything inward. The crenellations, the parapet, the window embrasure his grandfather had carved with the Frey sigil, inward, as though the stone had simply decided to sit down. Walder's hands were on the windowsill. His knuckles were white. He could see the color of them in his peripheral vision, the pale, drained, bloodless white of a man gripping something he hasn't decided to grip. He looked at the field north of the Twins. The trebuchet stood exactly where it had stood. The craftsmen were already reloading it. They were doing this without hurry. He said, very quietly, open the bridge. Robb Stark's terms took 12 minutes to deliver. Walder sat at the negotiating table in the great hall of the Twins, the table where he had concluded contracts with 4 great houses, where he had mortgaged and leveraged and outweighted and outlasted, and listened to the terms and felt something he had not felt in 90 years of successful negotiation. The terms were not humiliating. That was the thing he could not find a place for. No demand for marriage, no significant gift of unspecified value, no punitive alliance clause that bound the Freys to the Stark cause regardless of outcome. The terms were passage, provisions sufficient for the column's march south, and 300 Frey men to serve with the northern host for the duration of the campaign. That was all. That was the price of everything Robb Stark had just demonstrated he could take. Walder looked across the table at 15 years old, in armor that was slightly too large in the shoulders and eyes that looked back at him with an attention that was not hostility and not warmth and not calculation. Just attention. The attention of a boy who had decided what he needed and was sitting at a table because tables were the correct location for completing what had already been decided. He did not want Walder Frey's loyalty. He wanted the river. The distinction had a specific weight. Walder sat with it. A man who wanted your loyalty needed you to maintain it, which gave you leverage for as long as you maintained it. A man who wanted your bridge and your supplies and 300 of your soldiers and nothing else did not need you afterward in any form. The terms that were not humiliating were more frightening than humiliation, because they meant that Robb Stark had assessed what Walder Frey was worth and arrived at a number, and that number was the bridge, 300 men, and 2 weeks of provisions. Everything else was not worth taking. Walder's jaw set. He picked up the quill. He signed. The machine column crossed the twins for most of a day. Walder stood at his gate and watched it. He stood there from the first carriage to the last, which was a thing he could not have explained except that he felt some obligation to witness the full length of it, to understand precisely what had crossed his bridge, to carry the information of it correctly in his memory going forward. Each machine rolling past on its ironwood spoke carriages, each axle carrying weight that pressed the bridge's old stone with a thoroughness that Walder felt through the soles of his boots on the gate's stone floor. Low, constant, a vibration that didn't stop for hours. The 300 Frey men fell in at the column's rear. They marched south, and none of them looked back. Walder watched them go the way he watched all things he could not stop, with perfect stillness and eyes that were already calculating something beyond the present moment. The last carriage cleared the southern bank as the light went flat and gray. He turned and walked back through his gate and closed it. He went to his solar and sat down in his chair by the fire, and sat there for a long time without calling for anyone. The calculation in his mind was not whether to betray Robb Stark. He was 90 years old. He had outlived 4 kings. He knew what calculations survived and which ones didn't, and he knew that a boy who could remove a tower's upper third from a quarter-mile away and then offer generous terms was a boy who had already thought about what came after and had decided Walder Frey was a minor variable in it. The calculation was when. And the calculation was for whom. He sat by the fire, and he watched it and he waited, the way he had always waited, for the river to show him which way it was running. The wood had a reputation that Jaime had always considered provincial. Locals called it the Whispering Wood, because sound moved through it strangely, arrived from wrong directions, carried further than it should. Whispered back from the tree line when conditions were right, in ways that made men on their first ranging look over their shoulders at things that weren't there. Jaime had catalogued this reputation and filed it alongside other rural superstitions that were useful only insofar as they affected the psychology of men he was commanding or fighting. The wood itself was trees. Very old trees with a canopy that closed the sky down to gray strips, and a floor soft with centuries of leaf fall that muffled hoofbeats and made the column's progress quieter than it should have been. That was the tactical reality. The whispers were acoustics. He rode at the head of his cavalry column and listened to the wood with the automatic attention of 15 years of soldiering, cataloging ambient sound the way other men cataloged expenditure or correspondence. Wind in the upper canopy, the horses breathing, his own cavalry's equipment sounds, the specific acoustic signature of 1,200 mounted men that he knew well enough to notice any deviation from it. He heard nothing wrong. The reports had been arriving for 2 weeks. Small folk accounts, filtered through Frey garrison men who were not military professionals, describing what they called strange wagons and bronze towers moving south on the King's Road. Walder Frey's own commander had sent a message whose language was so imprecise it conveyed almost no useful information. Something large, something unprecedented, something the writer had clearly not known how to classify. Jaime had made the correct professional assessment of these reports, which was to discount them. Not entirely, he noted them. He held the possibility of some unusual supply configuration in his peripheral attention, but discount them as primary intelligence. Small folk did not have technical frameworks for describing military equipment. Bronze towers could mean anything from a large scorpion to an unusual carriage with metal fittings. Unprecedented could mean unfamiliar. Robb Stark was 15, his army was green, and green armies carried things veterans didn't bother with because veterans knew what worked. Cavalry worked. Cavalry had always worked. You found the right ground, you committed at the right moment, and the thing in front of you ceased to be a problem. He was 3/4 through this particular line of thinking when the scout returned from the eastern edge of the wood at a gallop. The scout stopped his horse badly, too fast, the animal fighting the check, dancing sideways before it settled. The scout's face was doing something Jaime had seen perhaps twice in his career, the specific vacancy of a man whose brain had received information it did not have a category for and was still cycling through its available categories trying to find one that fit. He made the scout stop, made him breathe, asked him, very slowly and specifically, to describe what he had seen. The scout described what he had seen. Jaime was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." At the tree line, the northern infantry was formed in something his tactical education had no name for. He took it in fast, the way he took in everything in the field, sweep left to right, depth and width, then detail. Width, perhaps 300 men across. Depth, 8 rows, possibly more, impossible to see past the front formation. The front row's shields sat low, lower than a standard wall, and interlocked not at the edge but overlapping by a full third, the way roof tiles overlapped, the seam driven out of any direct approach. The spears were wrong. Too long. The shafts were darker than ash and thicker, close to twice the standard diameter. And they were not being held at an angle for use, they were being driven into the ground. He watched 2 men in the third row push their spear butts into the earth and lean their weight forward until the ground took the shafts and held them, and the men could step back and let the formation itself bear the weapon's weight. It was not a shield wall. It was a structure. He was already ordering the charge in his mind, calculating the angle of approach, the momentum required, whether to commit his full weight or hold a reserve for the anticipated gap on the eastern flank, when the first volley from the Scorpion Kings went overhead. High and wide. Deliberately so. The bolts traced lines through the gray air above the cavalry formation and landed in open ground 80 yards behind his rear column, and the sound they made in passing was not the familiar whistle of a bolt, but something lower and heavier, a displacement of air at a scale that a standard Scorpion couldn't produce. He had 2 seconds to process this. The second volley was lower. Bronze pots. Roughly 12 inches across, sealed at both ends, he identified them as objects before he identified them as weapons, which was the worst possible order in which to identify them. They came in on a flat trajectory, aimed not at the cavalry itself, but at the ground in front of the leading horses, and they hit the earth and split. Not exploded. Split, the bronze shell fracturing along scored lines that had been designed into it, the contents meeting air. The compound inside was colorless in the gray morning light. No dramatic color, no warning. It simply began to burn on contact with the atmosphere, and what it produced was a wall of fire approximately 2 feet high and 40 feet wide that appeared in the space between his cavalry's leading horses and the ironwood phalanx's front row as though it had always been there and they had simply failed to notice it until now. The horses stopped. Not a partial check. Not a reluctant slowing that a determined rider could push through. They stopped, the entire front rank, simultaneously, with the unified conviction of animals whose instincts are older than any cavalry training and considerably more reliable. The horses in the second rank pressed into the first rank. The first rank had nowhere to go. The column compressed itself from the rear forward and went from a charge to a static mass in the space of 5 seconds, and nothing Jaime or any of his riders did to their mounts in the next 30 seconds changed anything about this outcome. He saw the gap on the right flank in the same moment he accepted that the charge was finished. The eastern edge of the ironwood phalanx and the tree line, a gap of perhaps 25 yards. Room for 5 horses abreast. He turned his horse right without announcing it and drove hard for the gap, and 6 of his personal guard followed him, because they knew how he moved and moved with him, and they covered half the distance to the tree line before the ground changed. His horse hit it mid-stride. Bronze wire, woven into the undergrowth at ankle height, staked at intervals close enough to prevent any gap, designed to be invisible from horseback at speed. His horse's left foreleg caught the first strand, and the second stride's momentum did the rest. The animal went forward and down in a controlled collapse, that became an uncontrolled one. And Jaime went over its head in the specific way you went over a horse's head when you had done it before. Tucked, rotating, hands out of the fall to avoid trapping an arm, and landed in a roll, and came up in the leaf fall of the whispering wood floor with his sword already in his hand. He came up fighting. He was the best swordsman in Westeros. This was not ego. It was a technical assessment that 15 years of serious swordsmanship had consistently produced, and it was accurate in the same way that certain objects were heavier than they looked, as a property, not a claim. He came up fighting and he was good at it, and the men who came at him from the tree line were not. He held them for 90 seconds. The number was specific because he counted. 30 seconds to realize there were more men in the trees than the gap's apparent width suggested. 15 seconds more to understand that the men he was engaging were not the point. Another 30 seconds to look for the actual point and not find it. 15 seconds of looking for it in the wrong direction. It came from the left. A sound he had no reference for. A compressed, mechanical release, something between a snap and a concussion. A small version of the sound the machines made when they fired. The same family of sound in a smaller register. And then, something hit him from the left side, with a weight and a spread that his sword arm went into before his mind had time to instruct it. And the arm was wrapped and tangled before he understood what had wrapped it, and his left knee was in the leaf fall before he decided to put it there. He was kneeling. His sword arm was in a bronze-weighted net that had been fired from a mechanism he hadn't found because he'd been looking for gaps and not for the trees above the gaps. His left knee was in the dirt. His right hand had the sword grip and couldn't do anything useful with it. He looked at his situation with the rapid, unsparing attention he applied to all situations and arrived at its correct assessment in approximately 2 seconds. He stayed still. He heard the horse before he heard anything else. A large animal, walking slowly, navigating the tree roots with a rider who was not in a hurry. Then a wolf's breathing, low, close, the specific sound of an animal that was circling rather than approaching. Then the sound of northern cavalry pulling back from the tree line, a controlled withdrawal, unhurried. He waited. The horse stopped a few feet behind him. He could feel the animal's presence in the space between his shoulder blades. He did not turn around. A voice said, "Sir Jaime." Young, steadier than it had any right to be, given the owner's age, but the steadiness of a boy performing steadiness, rather than the steadiness of a man who had earned it yet. Jaime filed this. It was useful. "Lord Stark," he said to the leaf fall in front of him, "you have your father's eyes." He let a beat pass. And his machines, apparently, no response. He heard the horse turn and move away. He heard the wolf follow. He heard the northern men move in around him with the practiced quiet of men who had been waiting in these trees for precisely this moment, and were neither pleased nor displeased that it had arrived. They were simply completing a task. That was the detail he filed alongside everything else. They had been waiting. Not reacting. Waiting, in positions that assumed he would try the right flank, that assumed he would find the gap and drive for it, and that his horse would hit the wire at exactly the stride it hit it. The trap had been built for him specifically. Someone had read him before the battle started, and built a trap for the man he actually was rather than the man an average cavalry commander would be. He turned this over carefully while the northern men loaded him into a wagon with his wrists bound in bronze-fitted restraints that he did not test, because testing them was exactly what they expected him to do. Inside the wagon, moving south on the forest road, the world reduced to canvas and motion and the muffled sounds of the column reorganizing around him. Through the canvas came the machine's sounds, the Scorpion Kings being broken down, their tension released, the specific ironwood voice he had heard in the air during the volley, now in a lower register as the draw weight came off and the arms returned to neutral. It was not the sound he would have expected from a siege engine. It was not a mechanical sound. It was something between an exhalation and a note held on a very large string instrument, descending in pitch as the tension left the wood, resolving into silence. He had heard ballistas before. He had heard trebuchets. He had heard every category of siege equipment that Westeros produced, and several that Essos did. He had never heard anything like this. He filed this observation alongside the second one, which was simpler and carried more weight. He had been fighting in wars and single combats and skirmishes and duels since he was 16 years old. He had been held at knife point once by a drunk man at a feast who had been immediately disarmed. He had been wounded twice in the same shoulder, once in the thigh, once across the ribs in a way that still ached in cold weather. He had never been captured. Both observations went into the same place in his mind, the place where he kept things he intended to resolve. Not problems yet, not fully. Things requiring more information before they became problems he could work on properly. He had, as it turned out, a great deal of time for gathering information. The wagon moved south, and the forest thinned around it, and the whispering wood fell away behind him, whispering. From 5 miles out, King's Landing looked like something a god had left unfinished. The hills held it, 3 of them. The city spread across their slopes and down into the valleys between, contained by Aegon the Conqueror's walls the way a hand contains water, imperfectly, with pressure applied at every point. The Red Keep sat above everything on Aegon's high hill, its towers catching the morning light in a way that was probably beautiful if you had not spent the past 4 months riding toward it. The sept of Baelor's dome. The gates, walls 30 feet thick at the base, faced in the specific gray stone of the Crown Lands that had been quarried and dressed and mortared into place by Aegon's builders 300 years ago and maintained by every king since. 300 years of wall. Robb sat his horse on the Rose Road and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The column moved up behind him and stopped. He heard the engineers on the hammer's carriages behind him, the specific sounds of men who were calculating rather than waiting, measuring the ground with their eyes, walking distances they hadn't yet walked. He heard the Scorpion Kings being rotated on their carriages to face the walls. He heard Myrna somewhere in the middle of the column, directing the Frost Salt teams in the quiet voice she used when she had already thought through every contingency and was now simply executing them in order. He had written to Stannis 3 weeks ago. The reply had come in 6 days, which told him Stannis had been expecting contact and had his response already prepared. The letter was the most efficient communication Robb had received in the entire campaign. 4 sentences, no salutation, no closing pleasantry, confirmation of the naval timeline and the chain deployment, and a final line that said, "I will hold the bay. What you do with the walls is your business." From Blackwater Bay, beyond the city's eastern profile. He could hear the distant percussion of naval engagement beginning. Stannis was on time. He gave the order. The hammer moved forward. Cersei had been at the window since before dawn. She had not decided to be at the window. She had been in her chair reviewing correspondence, and then she had been at the window, with no memory of standing or crossing the room. The way certain events rearranged you without asking permission. Below her the city moved in its morning patterns, the markets opening, the guild halls filling, and to the south she could see the harbor's activity changing character as Stannis's fleet made its approach. The chain rising from the water, the Lannister galleys moving into position. The Tower of the Hand faced south and east. She could not see the Rose Road approach from here. She had been told the northern column was 5 miles out at dawn. She had been told about the hammer. She had been receiving reports about the hammer since the twins, each one slightly more precise and significantly more impossible than the last, until the reports had become a sequence of impossibilities stacked on top of each other that she had stopped trying to find a framework for and had simply stored as a list of facts about the world she was now living in. The Hammer of the North was assembled on the Rose Road approach. She had received confirmation of this 30 minutes ago. She sent for Grand Maester Pycelle. He arrived with the unhurried gravity he brought to all summons, his white robes adjusted, his chains arranged, his face composed in the expression of patient counsel he had worn through the reign of 4 kings. She asked about the wildfire caches. His eyes moved to hers with a fraction more attention than usual. The caches were not a subject that came up in ordinary council. He said they were ready, had been ready since the Mad King, that the Alchemists' Guild maintained them under standing arrangement, and that the compound remained stable indefinitely in sealed alabaster. She told him to inform the Guild, to prepare for possible ignition on her order. He absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things about Pycelle she had never fully decided whether to trust. She said, "Is there anything that can stop a machine of this kind?" He was quiet, for a moment, longer than she expected from a man who had an answer for everything. He said that he had read of nothing in the Citadel's records, and that the Citadel's records were extensive. She said, "Neither have I." He left. She went back to the window. From somewhere north of the walls, too far to see from her position, but the morning was cold, and sound carried, she heard something begin. The sound the hammer made under full tension was not one sound. 6 ironwood throwing arms working in concert produced 6 simultaneous voices in the same resonant frequency family, and the effect was not a single note but a chord, something architectural, something that felt structural, as though the machine under tension was itself a building that had to be inhabited before it could be understood. The craftsmen and the engineers could feel it in their chests before their ears sorted it into something coherent. The cavalry nearest the hammer's position moved their horses back 20 yards without being ordered to, and the horses did not resist. Robb sat his horse at a distance that allowed him to see both the machine and the mudgate on the city's northern face. He had chosen the mudgate from the schematic analysis Myrna had done over 3 weeks of calculation. Not the King's Gate, not the Dragon Gate, the Mudgate, because the arch geometry of the Mudgate had a specific relationship between its keystone and its flanking walls that the calculations identified as a failure point under the hammer's throw weight. She had shown him the mathematics. He had understood perhaps a third of it. He had trusted the rest. The hammer's release was quieter than the cord. The cord built and then nothing. A silence so complete and sudden that the men nearest the machine flinched from it, because their ears had been preparing for an escalation and received an absence instead. And then, in that absence, the stone was already in the air, and the distance was being covered at a velocity that made the stone's flight last less than 3 seconds, and then the Mudgate's upper left quadrant received it. The sound arrived at Robb's position as a double impact, the stone's contact and the wall's structural response, a half-second apart. The first percussive and blunt, and the second a deeper, longer architectural groan that ran through the gate's stonework and came back up through the ground and arrived in his horse's legs before it arrived in his ears. Gray Wind went still beside him, not frightened. Listening, he looked at the mud gate. The arch had not fallen. The face of it had not shattered or cratered in the way walls cratered under conventional siege fire. The keystone had moved. 3 inches inward, he could not see the 3 inches from this distance, but he could see the line of the arch, and the line was wrong now. The subtle wrongness of a curve whose center has shifted. The geometry of 300 years of deliberate engineering disagreeing with itself. Every stonemason in his column who was looking at the gate went quiet. She felt the first impact through the window glass. Her palm was on it, she had put it there without deciding to, and the vibration arrived through the frame and through the glass and into her hand before the sound reached her ears, and before her eyes had found what had changed in the gate's profile on the northern wall. She felt it first. Then she saw it. The arch. The mud gate's arch. The line of it was wrong. She pulled her hand back from the glass and looked at her palm. The vibration was gone. Her palm looked exactly as it always looked. She pressed it against the side of her thigh and focused on the window and waited. She did not wait long. The second stone hit the same section. The arch failed at the keystone first, the keystone driving inward as the impact transferred its energy into the structure rather than through it, and the structure's response was to find its weakest point and allow the failure there rather than distribute it, which was architecturally correct behavior and tactically catastrophic. The cracks ran both sides simultaneously from the keystone's new position. Not slowly, not in the gradual, visible way that walls cracked under sustained battering from conventional engines. They ran, a single motion, bilateral, following the arch's curve down to the foundations, and the stones in the arch shifted from a unified weight-bearing structure into a collection of objects that had been holding each other up and had now lost the argument about it. The gate folded inward. Not a clean collapse. A fold, the arch, the doors, the flanking walls on each side. 20 feet of city wall in either direction, folding as though the stone had a hinge point it had kept hidden for 300 years and was only now prepared to use. The dust took the view for 30 seconds. When it cleared, the gap where the mudgate had been was large enough to ride 6 horses abreast. Robb looked at it for a moment. He turned to the Scorpion King operators on his left flank and gave the order to begin clearing the walls. The bolts began to move in flat, fast trajectories that traced lines between the Scorpion King positions and the defensive stations on the city ramparts, and the Lannister garrison soldiers on those ramparts made the correct assessment of their situation and began to move away from them, not routing. Withdrawing, Robb noted the distinction. These were professional soldiers doing professional mathematics. He turned to his cavalry. He said, "Stay here." He walked Grey Wind through the gap alone, not a charge, not a demonstration of speed or force, a walk. The pace a man walked when he wanted every eye on the walls to find him and register exactly what they were seeing, and have time to register it fully. The wolf's head was at his knee. The wolf's amber eyes were on the dust-settled rubble to either side without concern, the way Grey Wind looked at everything, assessing it as terrain rather than threat, finding it adequate. Robb rode through what had been the mud gate and looked at Flea Bottom opening up ahead of him on the slope. The city's poor were at their doors and their windows. He looked at their faces, the specific quality of expression that was not welcome and not hostility, but something between the two. The expression of people who had survived multiple changes in who controlled the street they lived on and were waiting to determine whether this change required immediate action or watchful stillness. He rode at a walk and did not draw his sword, and made no gesture of any kind toward the people in the doorways. They stayed in the doorways. The Scorpion King fire continued on the walls above and around him, systematic, targeting the garrison positions and nothing below them. He could hear the bolts passing overhead at intervals, that specific displaced air sound, heavy and fast and low, tracing lines between the machines and the ramparts with a consistency that communicated control rather than desperation. The Lannister garrison was off the walls within 20 minutes. The infantry moved into the streets behind him, disciplined, moving toward the positions on the pre-planned routes, making no contact with the population that did not have to be made. Flea Bottom gave him nothing. No resistance, no cooperation. Correct stillness. He reached the slope's midpoint and stopped and looked up. The Red Keep stood on Aegon's high hill with its gates closed and its towers lit and its walls intact, untouched by anything that had happened below it in the past hour. From its highest window, visible because the morning had cleared and the light was direct, a single lamp burned. Steady, someone was standing at that window. He could not see who. He did not need to see who. His commanders caught up to him on horseback, breathing hard, ready. The Greatjon's voice came from his right flank with the specific quality it used when it was physically restraining itself, proposing the night assault, the ladder teams, the breach approach, while the garrison was still reorganizing. The momentum they had, the necessity of pressing it now. Robb did not look away from the window in the Red Keep's highest tower. He said, "We camp here tonight." The Greatjon began to respond. Robb said it again. Quietly, the way his father said things he did not intend to revisit. The Greatjon went quiet. The Iron Throne was in the room, and nobody was sitting in it. Tyrion had been in this room dozens of times, and the throne had always had someone in it, which was the point of the throne. It was a location that required occupation the way a wound required attention. The moment you stopped applying pressure, something went wrong. The throne sitting empty in the morning light, with the long table arranged on the floor below it in a rough circle and 7 men seated around that circle, was a new configuration. He was still deciding what it meant. He poured himself wine and sat down and looked at the faces. Robb Stark at the table's northern position, which was not a designated northern position, but had become one through the self-organizing logic of rooms where people understood power. 15 years old. The armor was off, he was in northern, wool, gray, and the effect was that he looked both younger and more authoritative than he did in steel, which was a combination Tyrion had not previously encountered in a single person. Catelyn Tully behind his left shoulder, not seated, which was a choice. Oberyn Martell across the table with his elbows on the wood and his dark eyes moving between faces, with the specific quality of attention that meant he was reading something other than what people were saying. He had arrived 2 days ago from Dorne, uninvited, with 6 paramours and 40 spears, and a stated interest in the outcome of the proceedings that he had not yet specified further. Tyrion had spoken with him for an hour the previous evening, and come away with two certainties. Oberyn was the most dangerous man in the room, and he already knew what he wanted, and was waiting to see whether anyone would offer it. Lord Jon Royce, Bronze Jon, in his ancient bronze armor that he had worn to the council table without apparent self-consciousness, the runes covering its surface catching the light when he moved. Stannis Baratheon with the jaw of a man who was right about everything, and had never once found this satisfying. Edmure Tully, alive and present because the column's passage through his territory had been conducted with a discipline that left his people materially unharmed and politically complicated. Wyman Manderly, very still, which for a man of his dimensions communicated something, and at the table's edge, not quite fully at it, Jon Snow. Tyrion looked at Jon Snow and thought about what Varys had told him during the recess, and then thought, very deliberately, about something else. The first hour was the Iron Throne. This was predictable. Every conversation in this room for the past 300 years had eventually been about the Iron Throne, and the people around this table had not collectively evolved past the habit simply because one of them had spent 4 months moving machines south to break the walls. They argued about legal succession, Stannis's claim, its validity, the precise interpretation of Robert's legitimate line. And they argued about practical legitimacy, which was the more honest argument and the one nobody wanted to have first, because having it first required admitting that legal succession and actual power were not always the same object. Tyrion let them argue. He drank his wine and watched the faces and waited for the room to locate its actual subject. Oberyn found it first. He had been quiet for 40 minutes, which was, Tyrion suspected, approximately 39 minutes longer than was comfortable for him. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke at a moment when 2 other conversations were happening simultaneously, and the quality of his voice, controlled, precise, carrying the specific authority of someone who had decided they were done waiting, was enough to stop both of them. He said, "The throne is a chair. The question is the machines." The room went still. He looked at Robb Stark across the table, not hostility. Something closer to the attention a swordsman paid to a swordsman, the recognition of a specific kind of threat assessed cleanly, without the performance of being unimpressed. He said, "You built things that can kill dragons." "Who taught you?" Robb said, "The first men taught us. 8,000 years ago." A silence. Oberyn said, "And what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Robb said, "Point it north." Oberyn sat back. His expression did one thing and then returned to neutral, and the one thing it did was not what Tyrion expected. It was not satisfaction. It was not the cynicism he used as a default surface. It was something briefly, genuinely open, a man receiving an answer that landed in a place he had not known was available for landing. Then it was gone, and his face was his face again. Lord Jon Royce said he wanted to see one of the machines before the council continued. The council adjourned to the courtyard. A Scorpion King had been positioned there that morning at Robb's instruction, which meant Robb had anticipated this request or something like it, which meant 15 years old was not, apparently, an accurate description of what Robb Stark was. Tyrion filed this with the other things he was filing and walked out into the cold morning air. Royce approached the machine the way he approached things he was uncertain of, directly, without hesitation. With his hands at his sides and his eyes moving over the construction in sequence, he walked the full length of it. He crouched at the chassis join and looked at the ironwood sections and how they socketed. He stood and moved to the tension arm and looked at the sinew cord and the bronze fittings at the arm's terminal points. Then he stopped. He was at the firing mechanism, the bronze-geared release assembly that the old craftsmen from the eastern villages had spent 3 months calibrating to tolerances the schematic specified in rune notation. Royce's hand went out and traced the rune cluster nearest the release point without touching the metal, hovering a 1/4 inch above it the way Bran Stark's hand had hovered above a schematic 7 months ago in Winterfell, as though the rune required a moment of consideration before contact. He said, "This is a House Royce rune." Nobody spoke. He said, "Not a clan rune. Not a First Men general notation. A specific family mark. My family's mark." He straightened. He looked at the rune for another moment. This machine was partly designed by my ancestors. He turned and walked back inside without further comment. He sat down at the table and said, "I support the compact." Tyrion watched Oberyn watch this and saw something in Oberyn's face that he had not seen before. The expression of a man who had been told a story he believed was mythology and had just seen a piece of physical evidence that required him to revise the category. Tyrion presented the compact after the midday recess. He presented it as a framework rather than a proposal, which was a meaningful distinction. Frameworks were structural and implied that alternatives would require their own structural coherence, while proposals implied that rejection was a reasonable option. He had thought carefully about this. The terms were Stannis to the Iron Throne, legitimate, legally defensible, capable of ruling in the way that ruling actually required, as opposed to the way the songs described. Stannis had the right and the temperament for law, and a realm that had just watched its walls come down needed law more than it needed warmth. Robb Stark named Lord Paramount of the North, the Trident, and the Vale, a northern hegemony that stopped short of a crown, because Robb had not sat in the Iron Throne, and everyone in the room had noticed him not sitting in it. The machines remained northern technology. The schematics were not distributed south, copied, or shared with any Citadel maester without the Lord Paramount's explicit written consent. The south would send grain north, 1% of harvest from every castle above a certain productive capacity, annually, indexed to yield. The northern contribution to the realm in return was the machine's defensive capability, positioned at the wall. Maintained by northern engineers, available for the realm's defense against the threat the wall had been built to contain. The debt was acknowledged. It ran in both directions. Stannis said, 1%. Tyrion said, 1% sustained over 20 years is a more meaningful commitment than any marriage contract this table could produce. Stannis looked at him with the expression he used for things that were correct and that he resented being correct. He said, "Proceed." Edmure Tully had questions about the Riverland's position in the compact's geographic framework, which were legitimate questions and which Tyrion answered with the patience he reserved for legitimate questions. Manderly said nothing throughout and nodded once at the compact's conclusion, which was how Wyman Manderly expressed his highest approval. Catelyn Tully, still standing behind Robb's shoulder, said nothing throughout the entire council, which was a form of communication Tyrion respected. Jon Snow sat at the table's edge and did not reach for anything. This was the thing Tyrion had noticed about him since the column arrived at King's Landing, the quality of deliberate restraint that operated not like repression, but like choice. He was in the room. He was attentive. He spoke when addressed, and was precise when he spoke. He did not introduce himself, did not position himself, did not draw attention to any part of his history or his knowledge. What he was not reaching for was the information Varys had passed to Tyrion during the recess. The Tower of Joy. The names. The parentage that made Jon Snow, legally and genealogically, something that would have rearranged every conversation happening in this room if it were placed on the table. He was not placing it on the table. Tyrion watched him and thought, he knows. Not deduced, knew. The disk from the vault, the months with the engineers, the schematics he understood in rune notation that no one had formally taught him. A boy who grew up feeling like he didn't belong to the world he was born into and had found, in 8 months of moving machines south, a world that fit differently. The custodian of the machines was a more stable thing than a disputed claim to a throne someone else was already taking. More useful, more durable, more honest. Tyrion kept all of this in the part of his mind where he kept things he had decided not to use. The compact was signed in the early afternoon. Each lord signed in sequence. Stannis first, then Robb, then Royce, then Edmure. Then Manderly's seal pressed into wax with the White Harbor fish. Oberyn signed last, with the loose, deliberate stroke of a man who has been writing his signature for 39 years and has decided exactly what it should look like. The room emptied over the following 20 minutes. Business to conduct, arrangements to make. The logistical architecture of a new settlement requiring immediate attention from everyone who would have to implement it. Robb stayed. Tyrion stayed too, briefly, watching from the doorway. He watched Robb Stark stand in the empty throne room, with the Iron Throne 10 feet in front of him, and the morning light coming through the high windows and falling on the melted swords at the angles it always fell at this hour. Robb looked at it for a long time. Tyrion had been in this room when men sat in that throne, and when men refused it, and when men died trying to reach it, and when men died sitting in it. He had never been in this room with a man who had broken the walls to get here, and was now standing in front of the thing the walls were built to protect, and was simply looking at it, with the expression of someone completing an assessment rather than satisfying a desire, finding the thing adequately described by what he already knew about it. Robb turned around. He walked out of the throne room without touching it, without a word to anyone, without looking back. The Iron Throne sat alone in the light and said nothing. Tyrion finished his wine and went to find his father's correspondence, which he had been looking forward to reading since the Mudgate fell, and which he suspected was going to be, in its way, one of the more satisfying documents of the entire campaign. The Iron Throne did not melt cleanly. This was the first thing, the thing the engineers noted, and the craftsmen noted, and that Ned Stark noted from 20 feet away where he stood watching, arms at his sides, not touching anything. The swords that made up the throne had been forged at different times, by different hands from different alloys, each one carrying its own metallurgical history into the composite that Balerion's dragonfire had briefly unified and then released into its current form. They had been together for 300 years. They had developed, at the molecular level that no maester's education had language for, a resistance to separation that the forge's bellows had to work against for most of a morning before the first sections began to move. The smell was specific. Old metal going liquid had a smell that Ned knew from the White Harbor Forge, the copper sweet underneath the iron char. The specific mineral tang of alloys releasing their component elements back into each other at high temperature. This was that smell, but older. Denser, 3 centuries of sitting in the throne room receiving the ambient history of everything that had happened in that room, had apparently done something to the metal, though he could not have said precisely what. He stood 20 feet back and watched the throne come apart. The high seat went first, the piece that had cut every king who sat in it carelessly, the piece that old histories called the throne's judgment, its insistence on attentive rule. It went into the forge in 3 sections and came out as liquid, and was poured. The armrests followed. The base components last, the densest pieces, the ones that had absorbed the most of Balerion's original fire, and had re-hardened with the most conviction, as though the dragon's heat had instructed them to hold their form, and they had spent 300 years following the instruction. The molds were waiting. Myrna had designed them over the previous 2 days with the specific focus she brought to any material problem. Not urgency, not sentimentality, just the correct sequence of decisions made in the correct order. Bolt tips for the Scorpion Kings, cast to the schematics tolerances, gear fittings for the trebuchet release mechanisms, replacing components that had worn across the campaign. Bindings for the hammer's primary frame where the ironwood sections met the bronze housing. The Iron Throne became, by late afternoon, functional parts of the machines going north. That it was also something else, that the swords welded by Balerion's fire into the seat of 3 centuries of Westerosi power were now bolt tips that would fly north to hold the wall against the dead, was visible to everyone present and mentioned by nobody. The engineers were not paid to mention it. The craftsmen understood it without needing to discuss it. Ned watched the last pour cool in its mold and said nothing, and walked back toward the city. They were alone for the first time since the cell in the lower level of the Red Keep. The forge's noise was sufficient. The bellows, the hammers shaping the new components, the craftsmen's necessary communication across distances, it covered their voices without requiring them to lower them, which meant the conversation could happen at a normal volume and still belong only to them. Ned leaned against the warehouse wall, and Robb stood a few feet away, and they were quiet for a moment in the way they were sometimes quiet together, the specific stark silence that was not absence, but the shared understanding that words would follow when they were ready. Ned asked about the march, not the victories, not the twins' demonstration or the Whispering Wood or the Mudgate. He had reports on all of those, had read them in the cell in the lower level, while the city was still settling around its new silence. He asked about the decisions, The moments where Robb had been in the position of choosing between two things that the leather case hadn't covered, because no letter could cover everything, and what he had chosen and why. Robb answered honestly. He talked for perhaps 10 minutes, the great John at the neck, the discipline question with the infantry south of the Twins. The night he had made the Scorpion King forward deployment decision without consulting anyone, because there had been no one to consult who knew the machines well enough for the consultation to be meaningful. He talked about the moment outside the Mudgate when his commanders had pushed for the night assault on the Red Keep, and he had said no. He said, "You should have told me." He said it without heat, a fact being placed on the table. Ned said, "You needed not to know, so that you could decide without knowing." Robb was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a Lannister argument." "I know." The forge was loud around them. Someone dropped a mold fitting, and the metal ring of it crossed the warehouse floor and faded. Ned said, "The machines are yours now." He said it the way he said things that had been decided before the conversation began. "I'm going home." Robb nodded. One single motion. He had known this was what the conversation was building toward, and had already done whatever internal work the knowing required, because when the words arrived, he received them without visible difficulty. He was 15 years old, and he received them without difficulty. They did not embrace. They stood in the forge's noise for another moment, and then Ned pushed off the warehouse wall and walked back toward the city, and Robb turned to find Myrna and discuss the column's departure sequence. And that was the conversation. Short, quiet, every word where it needed to be. Catelyn's letter from Winterfell arrived on the morning of the column's departure. She read it in a room in the Red Keep that faced east, that caught the morning light early and held it, that had no strategic significance, and no history she was aware of, and was therefore one of the few rooms in this building she could sit in without the room doing something. Sansa was well. Arya had, according to Old Nan's most recent account, resumed teaching Bran to climb the exterior of the Godswood Wall, which was explicitly against every instruction Catelyn had ever given on the subject. The littlest ones were sleeping properly. The household was intact. Winterfell was cold and full of itself, which was what Winterfell always was. She read the letter twice. When she finished the second reading, she set it in her lap and her hands went still. Not holding the letter, not planning anything, not managing the shape of the next hour or the next decision or the next conversation that would require her to be the person this campaign had required her to be. Her hands rested in her lap with the letter between them, and the morning light came through the window, and she sat in it. Perhaps 2 minutes. Perhaps 3. She did not count. That was the thing. She did not count. The column formed outside the northern gate before dawn. The machines had been broken down the previous day and loaded onto their carriages with the now familiar efficiency of engineers who had done this enough times that each movement had found its correct sequence. The Scorpion Kings first, their carriages lighter than the trebuchets, and faster to form up. The trebuchets behind them, the hammer last. Its canvas wrappings tight against the cold that had been increasing for the past week with the specificity of a northern winter announcing itself ahead of schedule. The city watched them go, not the lords and the newly installed administrators. They had their own business, the logistical architecture of the compact requiring immediate attention from everyone who would have to maintain it. The city itself. The people who had watched the machines come through the Mudgate and had made their assessment and had stood in their doorways and remained still. They were at those doorways again now, in the pre-dawn cold, and their expression was the one that had no precise word for it, the one that was not grief and not relief, but the space between the two, where something large had happened, and the body was still processing whether it had been survived or simply witnessed. The column moved north, Robb at the front, Grey Wind's head at his knee. The King's Road home was the same road south but going the other direction, which sounds like nothing and is in fact everything. Robb rode at the front and did not look back. Catelyn rode behind him with the expression of a woman who has completed something and is not yet certain what comes next, but has decided to allow the uncertainty to exist without resolving it prematurely. Jon rode in the middle of the column with the engineers. He had been riding with the engineers since somewhere south of the Neck. Drawn there by the same force that had drawn him through the vault door 7 months ago, the rune notation on the schematic rolls spread across the engineer's portable table, visible through the carriage's open side, the characters cycling through their patterns in the firelight during the evening halts. He had started asking questions in the first week. The questions had become conversation. The conversation had become something closer to collaboration by the time the column was south of the Twins. He understood the rune notation now, had understood it for months, could read the schematics independently, track the calibration records, identify the specific character clusters that indicated material tolerances versus operational parameters. He had not told anyone this. He was not certain why. Perhaps because knowing it felt like something that belonged to the space between what he was and what he had not yet decided to become, and announcing it would close that space before he was ready. He rode with the engineers and read the schematic rolls and said nothing about what he understood, and the King's Road moved north beneath them. Castle Black in winter was a different place than Castle Black in summer. In summer it was merely harsh. In winter it was absolute, the wind coming off the wall with the full conviction of something that had been traveling south for 300 miles across open ground, and had found, at Castle Black, its first significant obstacle, and was prepared to address this fact continuously and without pause. The cold was not weather. It was position. The position of a place that existed at the boundary of what the world was willing to sustain. The column arrived at the base of the wall in late afternoon. The Black brothers on the wall's top saw them coming from miles out, the machine carriages raising dust visible at distance even in winter's flat light, the column's length stretching south on the King's Road farther than a standard supply train. They lined the wall's upper edge and looked down and said nothing to each other that the men below could hear. Lord Commander Mormont came down in the cage with 2 men. He descended at his own pace, without hurry, and emerged at the wall's base, and walked toward the column with the rolling, deliberate stride of a man who had been walking across hard ground for 40 years and had made his peace with the distances involved. He stopped in front of the nearest Scorpion King carriage. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, the full catalog inventory, everything taken in and assessed and stored. Then the trebuchets. Then the hammers wrapped components on their transport frames, the ironwood bulk of the throwing arm visible through the canvas. He looked at Robb Stark. He said, "Is this for the dead?" Robb said yes. Mormont looked back at the machines. Something moved behind his eyes and settled. He said, "Then bring them up." Jon was at the top of the wall before the machines had finished ascending. He had ridden the cage up alone, without explanation, and the brother operating the mechanism had asked no questions, because Castle Black brothers had learned, over centuries, that certain people needed to be at the top of the wall at certain moments, and the correct response to this was to operate the mechanism and say nothing. The wind at the top was the wind he had always known would be there, total, committed, erasing everything behind it the way a tide erased writing in sand, leaving only the present moment and the view north. The haunted forest ran from the wall's base to the horizon, a dark mass against the white ground, and beyond the forest the trees ended and the white that did not end began. Open, unbroken running north, until it became something that maps had a notation for, but no word that was adequate to the fact of it. He had known what was in the white since childhood. Not known in the way you knew things from books or reports or the careful accounts of rangers who had come back from beyond. Known the way the wall itself knew, as weight, as permanence, as the reason the wall existed and the reason it had not been enough, and the reason what was coming back across the white was coming with a certainty that patience and stone could not address. He stood at the wall's edge and looked north. Below him, the mechanisms were working, the cage ascending with the first Scorpion King's disassembled components, the brothers at the top ready to receive them and begin reassembly. He could hear Myrna's voice from below, directing the sequencing, her tone carrying up through the cold air with the same unhurried clarity it always had. As though the wall's dimensions were a material problem like any other material problem, and the correct approach was the correct sequence of decisions made in the correct order. The Scorpion Kings were positioned at the wall's intervals between Merlins, their throwing arms facing north, the trebuchets at the towers, the hammer at Castle Black's central rampart. Its throwing arm drawn back to draw position and held, patient, the ironwood voices, in their sustained resonant chord that the wall's stone picked up and carried and held the way the wall held everything, with the total commitment of something built for exactly this purpose. The machines that had broken Walder Frey's tower faced north. The machines that had held the Whispering Wood faced north. The machines that had taken down the mudgate of a city that had stood for 300 years faced north, toward the white that did not end, toward the thing moving through it that had been moving for longer than the wall had been standing. The Andals brought crowns and gods. We brought the tools to bury the dead. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.